On Primetime Politics, the international impact of a U.S. indictment.
Insofar as Canada is concerned, we have said that they have consistently given space to anti-India extremists and violence.
New Delhi continues to dismiss concerns of Indian involvement in the murder of a Sikh Canadian. This despite a similar plan uncovered in New York and the criminal indictment of an Indian national who was allegedly involved. How will this affect India and its relations with both Canada and the United States? Also,
there was one plane that met the requirements. That's the plane that we bought.
Awarding a multi-billion-dollar contract to an American company while dismissing the Canadian alternative. What impact will that have on Canadian workers and this country's aerospace industry? We will speak with Unifor. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. The fallout from a U.S. indictment is still being felt in 3 countries today. On Wednesday, an Indian national was charged in a murder-for-hire plot to assassinate a Sikh American. And there is a Canadian connection, as U.S. prosecutors say the intended victim was a known associate of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was killed outside of BC Gurdwara back in June, and whose killing was raised by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons this fall. Take a listen to some of the reaction we heard this week from both Canada and India.
We've taken note of the U.S. Justice Department filings in the United States yesterday. Again, I had been updated on some of this work by CSIS and the RCMP as far back as last summer, and I know from discussions last evening they continue to be very engaged with a whole series of American partners.
As regards the case against an individual that has been filed in a U.S. court, allegedly linking him to an Indian official, this is a matter of concern. We have said, and let me reiterate, that this is also contrary to government policy. Insofar as Canada is concerned, we have said that they have consistently given space to anti-India extremists and violence, and that is actually the heart of the issue. Our diplomatic representatives in Canada have borne the brunt of this, so we expect the government of Canada to live up to its obligations under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations.
Well, joining us now is our weekly journalist panel. Robert Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Robert Russo, the former Bureau Chief for both the Canadian Press and the CBC. Hello to the 3 of you.
Hello, Michael.
So obviously we're going to begin with India here because, you know, U.S. prosecutors say that the intended target in the U.S. was on the same target list as Singh Nijjar. So I wonder, with that revelation, how does that change or further our understanding of what happened here in Canada?
I mean, there are a lot more details in that indictment, obviously. We've learned that there were more targets of this plot. We've learned, actually, to me, it's very interesting, the window on what happened here, the detail that we got out of the indictment versus what we got in Canada, which was a blanket statement that there were some allegations. But it's pretty clear now it's because there was an informant, a source inside the plot in the U.S. that could reveal these details, and enough so that they can take it to court. What does that mean for an investigation ending up in any kind of charges here in Canada? That's pretty unclear to me. But it was a fascinating glimpse inside what prompted the Prime Minister to go public in September.
I'll get to that in a second, but Rob, your reaction first.
Sure. It makes it look like it was an exponentially wider plot, multiple targets, transnational in nature as well. And it makes India look more like one of those authoritarian regimes that wants to eliminate its opponents off its own shores. And there aren't many countries that do that. Russia is one of those countries. Vladimir Putin's Russia is one of those. And it begs the question, how close do democracies want to get to a country that is prepared to execute its opponents overseas on their own shores?
Bob?
Well, look, I mean, for me, it's the Americans were successful in uncovering this, arresting the person. Canada was aware of this. We've got nobody arrested. We didn't even manage to protect the life of Hardeep Singh Najjar, who was assassinated by a masked gunman. We know that 3 other Canadians were also on the hit list. Fortunately, they were not killed by this, but you know, you compare almost everything, you know, whether it was the Chinese police stations where the FBI makes arrests, we put a police car outside these fake Chinese police stations, no arrest, and now we have, you know, a Canadian who was assassinated and still no arrest, and the RCMP have not been able to say at all where they are in terms of this investigation. But we all know the longer it is, the less likely there's going to be arrest.
Yeah, well, without a doubt, it's very extraordinary that this has happened even in the first place. But it's also jarring, though, because it's India, right? Like, if you look at this country's Indo-Pacific strategy, India plays a big part of it. And in fact, when you go through that strategy, India is named as a partner in defending the values Canadians hold dear, and yet this happens. So do we need to rethink that partnership? Do we need to rethink India, at least while Modi's in power?
It seems to me that that is a broader discussion for many countries in the world, including the U.S., because, look, India's been the belle of the ball ever since China was aggressively around the world, acting in a way that pretty clearly signaled its authoritarian character and coercing other countries and leveraging its economic weight. Many countries around the world, India, or rather Canada and the U.S., saw India as the counterweight to that, right? The bully in the region, the democracy, the world's largest democracy. We could all embrace it because it was a democracy and a growing economy. But I don't think that even as bad as all this is enough to suddenly change the foreign policy of countries like Canada and the US and the UK and Germany, EU. Everybody wants to do business in India right now, and I don't see this as fundamentally changing that calculation. They will still, and we've heard it already, those governments all say they want to engage with India. I mean, Joe Biden and his Secretary of State have had these same conversations that Trudeau and his people had with the India officials. The only reason perhaps they got a better hearing is because of the economic partnership there and the economic weight that each carries. So yes, maybe we do have to rethink it a bit, but I don't see that fundamentally the desire to engage India will change.
Rob?
You know, it's interesting. This happened a month before Prime Minister Modi was welcomed to the White House in Washington, where there was a glittering ball. Celebrities were invited. President Biden showed no traces whatsoever of this being in any way a hiccup. It is clear that this is one of those equations. You know, Henry Kissinger just died a couple of days ago. He used to talk about values versus interests. And this is one of those times when countries are going to decide whether or not they want to do business with a country that shares its values, or whether it's in their interest to have a relationship with a country like India. Right now, it looks like the United States, taking a look at India's growth, I think it was 7.6% GDP growth last quarter. They believe it's probably in their interests to continue to nurture the relationship with India while trying to draw red lines around what India can do, but not necessarily share values with India.
Bob?
Well, first of all, India under Modi is drifting towards authoritarianism, and that's something that everybody should be concerned about. But
Noted by human rights groups around the world.
Absolutely, but real politics is real politics here. India is the world's largest, has the largest population. It's a fast-growing economy, and more significant, it is the most important counterweight to China, the world's second biggest economy and the world's second biggest military. The United States needs India, and so does Vietnam, so does the Philippines. All of those countries in the region are very, very concerned about China, particularly the way they've been operating in the South China Seas, but they've been extending their reach in these shipping trade zones, and there is no way in the world that we're going to have a rupture in Indian relations with Western countries because of that.
And don't forget, look, all of this was known to the governments, at least at the highest levels of government, before all the G20 leaders went to India in September and had meetings with Modi, and yet it was only after that Canada came forward with its allegations, but again, with very little detail. And yet, you know, Biden at that G20, we heard nothing of Biden's concerns around the plot that was unfolding in the U.S. when he was in India. It was all behind closed doors. Why? Because nobody wants to embarrass the Indian government on that stage right now. It's not worth it to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads me to my other question, because you were talking about the Prime Minister standing in the House of Commons, and it's really a marked difference from how we've learned about the American allegations, right? It had to be filed as an indictment. Once the indictment was released, then the details came out of the investigation.
I mean, well, there's a reason why the Prime Minister came out earlier than everybody else, is that, we were going to publish the story. And he just he didn't want it to be in a newspaper, so he got out ahead of the newspaper story. I'm sure that he would have preferred to wait until these indictments were unsealed before he came out and spoke about the issue. So I don't think it wasn't an issue that he was trying to rush out and embarrass Modi. It was just that, the media got ahead of him.
Yeah, the details were out there. But does this mean that we need to think about how we as a country start approaching India then? Because if this is happening at the same time, how do you address these issues while still pursuing something like the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, we've already started to reconsider how we deal with them, haven't we, as a fallout of this? I mean, yes, some visas that were previously suspended now are being issued again by the Indian government, but this has caused a huge diplomatic rupture. Canada withdrew 41 of its diplomats, 2/3 of its diplomatic contingent in that country. It's going to affect, and it has affected, the ties between the two. And, it's fine for the Trudeau government to say, well, there are people-to-people ties and business connections, long-standing business and people-to-people ties that will carry through. But a lot of that depends on services provided by diplomats on the ground in the country. And, sure, they've renewed giving some visas, but I think that we're already seeing the impacts of this relationship and suffering as a result. Where does it go from there? I'm not sure. But like I said, in the bigger picture, I don't see this government also abandoning engagement with India over it.
Okay. Quickly losing time. And before we're done, I do also want to bring up another story, of course, happened earlier in the week, the invocation of Alberta's Sovereignty Act over the clean electricity regulations. Is this something to be concerned about? Rob, I'll begin with you.
Well, I think it's something to be concerned about in that it looks like it's another sort of opening on the national unity front. All of us kind of came of age covering national unity in Canada when there was a threat coming from Quebec. But you look at what's happening in Alberta and what's happening in Saskatchewan, and there's more and more open defiance, it looks like, of the federal government. Now, is it going to actually amount to anything? You listen to Minister Wilkinson, and he says, I think he told CP yesterday or the day before, that he is prepared to be flexible on when some of these regulations come in. Some of them are not going to come in until 2044. I'm fond of saying I'm very popular at Christmas parties with my family because I have the magic quarter trick. I pretend to take a quarter, put it in a mayonnaise jar, put it under a porch, and next thing you know, it's teleported. Well, resolutions like this are very much the same way. The Premier can make a resolution, pass a resolution, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's the courts that will ultimately decide if it actually gets there. I think there's lots of room for negotiation and discussion before anything like that happens.
Well, the unity is going to be in even more fractured because we are expecting the federal government to unveil a new cap on oil and gas emissions on the industry, and we know that Alberta and Saskatchewan are loaded for bear on this one, and this is probably going to end up in the courts as well. And the problem that this government has is that they're bleeding 1,000 cuts on the carbon tax, that they made that ridiculous move to satisfy Atlantic Canada. Now you've got Indigenous people saying, well, what about us? We've got everybody else in the rest of the country saying this, and then you have Alberta and Saskatchewan saying we're being mistreated here. So I think the country is going to face increased national unity problems, not from Quebec now, but from Western Canada, and it's concerning.
Mm-hmm. Tonda?
I take a little bit more sanguine view than that on it. I think that federalism is a system fraught with some of these challenges and when there are conflicting priorities, especially in areas where there are overlapping jurisdictions like environment. So I think the country is working its way through some of those conflicts and challenges. I don't think everything would be magically resolved by a change in government at either level, because like Bob said, things like the oil and gas cap, those are going to be ongoing challenges for any government and any stripe of political government that comes into play. Because as far as I know, I don't know of any major political party that's actually said ditch climate change policies altogether and we won't fight climate change. It's about how do you get to the action to address climate change. And so I see that federalism has built in it a bit of these conflicts. And yes, a lot of it relies on the good faith interactions by all these players. And right now, I think there's some antagonisms that are going on, but, to a certain extent, 'twas ever thus. And, if Pierre Poilievre becomes prime minister, which the polls suggest he might, he opposes Danielle Smith on the pension plan changes that she wants to make. He will find himself clashing with provinces over various things, right? There were two conservative leaders, Danny Williams in Newfoundland and Stephen Harper in Ottawa, that clashed mightily over regulation of how you do offshore oil benefits and stuff. So I see that some of the conflict is built into the system, but the system has functioned and can still function, I think, as long as players like premiers actually follow sort of the way disputes get regulated. And that's through the courts, not through arbitrary acts of deciding, I'm going to decide what's unconstitutional and not the courts. Those are the things that raise the conflict.
Well, except that is exactly what the Alberta Act does, right?
But she dialed back some of even in this week's motion, she dialed back the whole notion that I'm going to declare unconstitutional. She said she's not going to force anyone to do something that's not legally permissible. So already some of that rhetoric is changing. And then on Tuesday or Wednesday, she was out hugging Chrystia Freeland and Randy Boissonneau after they announced the Dow chemical plant. So
and next week,
take a breath. Everybody take a breath.
Minister Guilbeault and Danielle Smith are going to be at COP together, and she's on an invitation list to dinner. Yeah. I'm sure she's going to be bringing a stack of some of those clippings that she was talking about, saying that Minister Guilbeault hadn't read. But that would be entertainment value if they throw open the doors and let us scribblers and lens people have a listen.
Who's going to take a bet on that one? But listen, out of time. Thank you for that. We'll convene. We got 2 more weeks of the sitting parliament before the year's done. So for now, Tonda, Rob, Bob, thank you for the time.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Time now for a look at the other stories making headlines today. We begin in the United Arab Emirates, where global leaders have gathered for the 28th Annual United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP28. Today, Canada's Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault announced a $16 million contribution. It will go to a global fund designed to help developing countries recover from loss and damage from climate change.
I want to congratulate the COP28 presidency for their leadership in securing the adoption of the fund on the first day of COP28 and for making a contribution right away. It is good to see others step up with early contributions, and we hope many others will join.
Guilbeault also let it be known today that 2 major court decisions at home have delayed this country's plans to implement a cap on oil and gas emissions. Guilbeault says the Supreme Court's ruling on the Impact Assessment Act and another federal court decision on Canada's plastics ban means the federal government needs to determine if its latest proposal infringes on provincial jurisdiction.
The federal government can certainly intervene when it comes to matters of pollution, and including climate pollution, but we have to be very careful not to impede on provincial jurisdictions. Has meant that we have to make sure that our regulation does exactly that it tackles pollution without infringing on provincial jurisdiction, and that has meant that it has taken a little bit more time than maybe we had initially anticipated.
Canada's COP28 delegation includes provincial, territorial, and Indigenous representatives. The UN Climate Change Conference will run until December the 12th in Dubai. Two federal ministers were on opposite sides of the country today to boost support for Canada's supply chains. The Transport Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, and the Natural Resource Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, were at the ports of Halifax and Vancouver. They both announced the creation of a national supply chain office. The ministers say this new office will help improve efficiency and resiliency, including mitigating impacts from disruptions.
Here and in facilities like this across the country, we are making investments to ensure that our critically important supply chains, the economic links that ensure affordable goods and products are delivered to markets and to Canadians, are as sustainable and as competitive as possible.
The Ontario Liberal Party will name its next leader this weekend. 4 candidates step forward to lead the party: Mississauga Mayor Bonnie Crombie, federal Liberal MPs Yasser Naqvi and Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, as well as Ontario MPP Ted Hsu. The winner will lead the party in the next provincial election against Doug Fort's Progressive Conservatives. Ballots will be hand-counted on Saturday, and the results will be revealed at an event at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre the same day. More than 103,000 party members were eligible to vote. And finally tonight, the U.S. House of Representatives has voted to expel Republican Congressman George Santos. The 311 to 114 vote means Santos, who represents New York's 3rd Congressional District, becomes just the 6th person in American history to be removed from the U.S. Congress. Santos has been plagued by scandals since he was indicted on 23 federal charges, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. Canadian firms that were hoping to get a shot at replacing Canada's aging Aurora surveillance planes were disappointed yesterday. Ottawa refusing to open up the tendering process and announcing a multi-billion-dollar contract with the American company Boeing.
There was one plane that met the requirements. That's the plane that we bought because that's the plane we need right now, and it had those requirements. I have great confidence in Canadian aeronautic industry. And, you know, there are some really great companies out there, but they did not have a plane that met these requirements. And unfortunately, right now, we needed that plane.
Well, to talk about this deal, we're now joined by Danielle Cloutier, Quebec director for this country's largest private sector union, Unifor. Danielle, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now, we just heard it from the defense minister in the interview that we did last night. The primary argument that Ottawa makes in choosing Boeing is that there was no other plane that could have done the job and in the time frame that Ottawa was looking for. How do you respond to that?
Oh, the fact proved that it's not true. Basically, there was the Mitsubishi plane that was already flying in the air and in use. So, and they were bidder on that possibility of contract. And apparently, Bombardier have given all the needed information to show that the plane would have been in the air, meeting the date of delivery set by the contract.
Mm-hmm. So you push back on that statement. You know, what is Unifor's biggest concern, though, in choosing Boeing and not a Canadian company's bid? What's your concern here?
What we don't understand is the lack of vision of the government. Why are Canada is probably the only country that do not use its own needs in terms of military equipment to try to develop his own capacity and his own expertise into it. We never argue that the government should give the contract to Bombardier blindly. What we said is the Canada government should put in place a fair bid to allow other companies like Bombardier to prove and demonstrate that they can achieve it. And it's not what the government have done. So, you know, I believe it's not a good decision from the government, and it's not the kind of decision that will allow Canadians to develop expertise, competency, and to be able to take their share in that big market. You know, we're never going to be able to do like bombing plane. But in terms of that kind of plane surveillance, we can have a bit of the market in there. And we don't understand why Canadian government does not allow the company to prove themselves.
Mm-hmm. You know, Danielle, can you build on that a little bit? You mentioned the fact that, you know, this country will not have the opportunity to develop the expertise. What types of jobs are lost when a contract goes to a U.S. company rather to a Canadian company? What type of opportunities are lost? How many job numbers are lost, would you say?
Oh, we do not pretend that that contract per se will make causing loss in terms of job. But the thing is, there's a few countries around the world, about 5, that can build a plane totally, including the certification of the plane. Canada is one amongst them. There's about 2 cities in the world that can still achieve that, the same thing. It's about Toulouse in France and Montreal in Canada. The thing is, how can we maintain that expertise if we cannot develop further and enter new market like the military market? So that's the point. It's not in terms of job loss right now, but it's in terms of opportunity for the future and, you know, positioning ourselves as a leader and continue to be that leader.
Mm-hmm. Now, Boeing is required to make targeted investments in Canada as a result of this deal. And apparently there are discussions to create a Boeing Center of Excellence in this country. Does that address any of your concerns in any way?
Oh, obviously we cannot be, you know, we're in favor of that. It's good news. But again, you know, it's not the kind of vision that we believe the government should develop. We never pretend that we need to stop having, you know, relation with Boeing. They have a lot of employees in Canada. A lot of them are unionized with us. So we do respect that company, and we do respect the fact that it's provide good Canadian job. But, you know, being the one who owns you know, those invention and those capacity is different, and that's a thing we should aim for.
Mm-hmm. Is there any way that the Trudeau government could make up for this? If not this contract, is there another that could counter what you see as the potential harms of going this route instead of opening up the bid process?
Yeah, we do believe that government need to develop some, you know, industrial politics, in aerospace, other few as well. But let's talk about aerospace. The Canada should develop a real industrial policy to make sure that we're gonna put them, you know, everything's around those companies there to continue the good job and to even grow and develop. And also the government should revise, you know, what we get in return when it's another country, you know. It's not clear what could be the kind of job we're going to have back, what kind of good qualification job we're going to have back. It could be anything. It's not clear. So the government should make sure that the end result, when we have something coming back to Canada from those contracts, that thing has a real value in terms of building, you know, prosperity for all Canadians.
Daniel Cloutier, thank you very much for the time today.
My pleasure again. Thanks.
And that is our program. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching Primetime Politics. We'll be back next week. Until then, have a great weekend.